The thing about Allen Iverson that people who never played against him fail to fully appreciate is that the challenge was never just physical. Anyone who watched him understood the physical part, the crossover that had become its own category of movement. The first step that existed in a time signature that defenders experienced as already having happened by the time their nervous systems registered it was coming. The scoring that emerged from a body that the NBA's own records confirmed was the smallest to ever carry that kind of offensive weight at that level of competition. The physical part was documented and measurable and available to anyone with access to a television. What was not available through a television, what only the people on the court understood with the full weight of having been on the receiving end of it, was the psychological component, the specific quality of Allen Iverson's competitive presence that operated below the physical, and that was, in the estimation of everyone who faced him across a career that lasted 15 years, more difficult to account for than anything his body produced. He carried something onto the court that had been built by everything that had tried to stop him before basketball, by a childhood in Hampton, Virginia, that had provided more reasons to fail than to succeed, by a system that had looked at a young black man from a specific kind of poverty and made specific kinds of assumptions that Allen Iverson had spent his entire life converting into fuel with an efficiency that left nothing unconverted. He carried it in the way he walked, in the way he looked at opponents before tip-off, in the way he absorbed contact that should have stopped him and used the absorption as propulsion, as if the resistance of the world had long ago become indistinguishable from the energy he needed to move through it. By the time he arrived in the 2001 NBA Finals, leading the Philadelphia 76ers against the Los Angeles Lakers, he had already been told in more languages and by more institutions than most people encounter in a lifetime that he was not supposed to be there. The Finals was simply the largest stage yet on which he intended to demonstrate the consistent error of that assessment. The Lakers in 2001 were not merely good. They were the kind of team that the history of the sport produces rarely enough that recognizing one while it is happening requires a willingness to set aside the skepticism that experience teaches. Shaquille O'Neal was at the specific peak that peaks of that magnitude achieve only briefly. The convergence of physical prime and technical development and competitive context that produces something the statistics capture but do not contain. Kobe Bryant was 22 years old, and in the process of becoming the player he would spend the next decade being, not yet fully arrived, but arrived enough that the difference between what he was and what he was becoming was visible only to people paying the closest attention. They had won the championship the previous year. They had gone 67-15 in the regular season. They had dismantled 4 playoff opponents with the methodical completeness of a team that understood its own superiority without needing to announce it. The consensus before the finals was not a question of whether the Lakers would win, but of how many games the series would require before the inevitable was confirmed. Allen Iverson had heard the consensus. This was not incidental. The consensus was the challenge, was the specific form that the challenge took when it arrived from an entire sport rather than from a single opponent. He had led the 76ers through a playoff run that had required everything from every person on that roster, had demanded from his teammates a level of collective sacrifice that was only possible because of what he was willing to give first and most completely. He had averaged 33 points through the Eastern Conference playoffs against opponents who had prepared for him with the full resources of their coaching staffs and had been insufficient anyway. He arrived in the finals carrying the weight of a city that had decided he was its representative in a sense that went beyond basketball, that had looked at a young man from impossible circumstances who played with the specific defiance of someone who had internalized the lesson that surrender was not an option and had recognized something of itself in him. Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson had a history that predated the finals. It was the history of 2 players who occupied adjacent positions in the game's hierarchy of difficulty, who had been compared since they entered the league in the same draft class, who had developed in parallel trajectories that were similar enough in certain dimensions to invite comparison and different enough in others to make the comparison ultimately insufficient. They had played against each other in the regular season and in all-star games, and in the particular theater of marquee matchups that the NBA schedules with the awareness that certain individual contests carry a narrative weight that transcends the game they are technically a part of. There was respect between them, which is a word that in the context of elite competition means something more complicated than it means elsewhere. It means I understand what you are and what you are capable of, and I hold that understanding without letting it become a limitation on what I intend to do to you. Game 1 was in Los Angeles, and the Lakers won every game in their own building that entire playoff run, and there was no structural reason to expect Game 1 to be different. The building was full with the specific fullness of a Staples Center crowd that understands it is witnessing something that will be discussed for years, that carries the dual awareness of witnessing greatness and of being present in history in a way that the regular season, however excellent, does not produce. Phil Jackson had prepared his team with the thoroughness that was his professional signature, had identified the specific ways the 76ers' attack could be contained, had designed a defensive scheme that accounted for Iverson's tendencies in a way that was, by any analytical standard, sound. Allen Iverson played 48 minutes in Game 1 and scored 48 points, and the 76ers won by a single point in overtime, and the basketball world went through the specific recalibration that it undergoes when something it believed to be settled turns out to be open. The 48 points were not the most important fact about what had happened, though they were the number that the headlines used because numbers are how sports communicate magnitude to people who were not present. The most important fact was the quality of those points. The way they had been accumulated against a defense that knew what was coming and had prepared to stop it, and had been unable to stop it anyway. The way Iverson had moved through the Lakers' defense with a combination of physical brilliance and competitive will that left the coaches who reviewed the film the next morning with the specific professional discomfort of people who had done their jobs correctly and been insufficient regardless. Kobe Bryant watched Game 1 the way he watched everything that directly involved him, with the total attention of someone for whom watching is not passive, but is a form of preparation, a data collection process that operates in real time and that files everything that might eventually be useful. He had guarded Iverson for stretches of Game 1 and had experienced from the inside the particular difficulty that Iverson presented. The way his size, which should have been a disadvantage, became a kind of weapon because it placed every physical assumption a defender carried into the contest in direct conflict with what they were actually encountering. He filed what he had learned. He filed it with the precision that he brought to everything that arrived from competition, without drama, without the noise of ego processing a difficult experience, simply as information that would be used. What happened between Game 1 and Game 2 happened largely in the space of Kobe's preparation, in the hours between the final buzzer of one game and the tip-off of the next that most people fill with recovery and that Kobe filled with work. The specific work of that interval was not physical primarily. It was the work of a mind processing what 48 minutes of direct competition with Allen Iverson had taught, building the architecture of a response that was not merely competitive, but was calibrated to the specific individual he was responding to. Phil Jackson observed this process in his player during the film session the morning after Game 1 and said, in the account he gave years later, that there was a quality in how Kobe engaged with the film that was different from his usual engagement, more specific, more pointed, as if he was not watching the game that had happened, but was constructing the game that would happen using the game that had happened as raw material. The Lakers won Game 2. They won Games 3, 4, and 5. The series ended in 5 games, and the championship returned to Los Angeles, and the narrative that had predicted the outcome was technically confirmed, even as the series itself had demonstrated that the confirmation was more complicated and more hard-won than the prediction had accounted for. But within the series, within the specific contest between Allen Iverson and Kobe Bryant, that ran through all 5 games like a thread that the larger pattern was organized around, something happened in Game 2 that the final statistics of the series did not fully capture and that the people who were on the court for it described, in the various interviews and retrospectives and documentaries that covered that period, as the moment the series turned in the register that mattered most. With 11 minutes remaining in the fourth quarter of Game 2 and the score within 4 points, Allen Iverson received the ball at the top of the key with Kobe Bryant directly in front of him. It was not the first time they had been in this position that game. It was the 14th time, by the count that the film session produced, and in the previous 13, Iverson had operated with the freedom that his preparation and his physical gifts and his competitive instinct produced when functioning together at their highest level. This time was different in a way that Iverson felt before he identified its source. The coverage was the same, the positioning was the same, the distance between his body and Kobe's body was consistent with what it had been in the previous 13 possessions. What was different was something that resided in how Kobe was standing within that coverage, a quality of readiness that was different from anticipation. That was not the readiness of someone waiting to react, but the readiness of someone who has already decided what is about to happen and is simply waiting for the moment to confirm the decision. Iverson went left, which he had done 7 of the previous 13 times in similar positions, the direction his body preferred when the space permitted the preference. Kobe was there before the direction was fully committed, not anticipating, not gambling there, with the precision of someone executing a plan rather than responding to a development. Iverson adjusted, which was what Iverson did when first options closed, adjusted with the quickness that had made defenders look stationary for a decade. Kobe adjusted with him. What followed in the next 3 seconds was a sequence that the film would show clearly, and that the crowd in the building experienced as a compression of competitive intelligence into a space too small to contain it. Iverson making decisions that were correct by every standard that had worked before, and finding each one addressed before it was fully formed. Not by athleticism alone, but by a reading of the situation that was operating one decision ahead of the situation itself. The turnover that resulted was not dramatic in its physical execution. The ball came loose and Kobe gathered it, and the Lakers pushed in transition and the score moved to 6, and the run that followed in the next 4 minutes extended it to 12, and the game was effectively over in the way games become effectively over when the momentum has moved with the totality and the direction that those 4 minutes produced. But the turnover was the fact that the coaches and the players and the people watching most closely pointed to when they described afterward the moment the series revealed its direction. Not because a turnover in the 4th quarter of Game 2 of the NBA Finals is in itself a decisive fact, but because of what it represented, because of the quality of the contest that had produced it, because it was the visible result of a preparation that had been built in the hours after Game 1 by someone who had experienced a problem and had solved it with the specific completeness that separated responding to greatness from being defeated by it. Allen Iverson averaged 35 points for the series. That number exists in the record, and it is a real number that describes a real performance, and it should be understood as what it was, one of the great individual efforts in finals history, produced by a player who took the largest team in basketball and made it work for every inch of every game, with a competitive ferocity that everyone who was present confirmed was as complete as any they had encountered. He did not lose the series because he failed. He lost the series because the Lakers were the Lakers of 2001, and because Shaquille O'Neal was what he was, and because Kobe Bryant, in the space between Game 1 and Game 2, had done what Kobe Bryant did with information that arrived from direct competition with the best, which was convert it, completely and without remainder, into something that made him harder to play against than he had been the night before. What Iverson said about Kobe Bryant in the years after the finals, in interviews that came with the honesty that retirement and distance make available, was not the language of someone describing an opponent in the diplomatic register of professional courtesy. It was more specific and more direct than that. He said that guarding Kobe, in the games of that series where the assignment went both directions, was the closest thing he had experienced to playing against someone who was inside your head before you had decided what you were going to do. He said it not with resentment, but with the particular respect of someone who has been tested at the highest level and is honest enough to describe what the testing actually felt like from the inside. Phil Jackson wrote in his journal after Game 5, after the celebration had moved through the locker room and the champagne had been poured and the trophy had been held, that the series had been the best education available in the distinction between excellence and greatness. That excellence was what Iverson had brought to every game, sustained and complete and beyond meaningful criticism. That greatness was something that included excellence and added to it the capacity to learn within the competition itself, to be challenged by the best version of an opponent and to produce, in response, a better version of yourself than the one that took the court the night before. He wrote that he had seen that capacity in one player across his career more consistently and more completely than in any other. He did not write the name. He did not need to. There was only one player in that locker room who had been tested in Game 1 and had arrived in Game 2 as something that Game 1 had not faced. The Journal knew who he meant. The series knew who he meant. And Allen Iverson, sitting in the visiting locker room after the final buzzer of Game 5 with 37 points in a losing effort, in the silence of someone who has given everything available and been met by something that had more, knew who he meant too.